Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of At last, I'm finally knocking out a book from the extensive TBR that I constructed for myself a couple of months ago. Which, in this episode, I'm reviewing the splatterpunk cosmic horror novella called Gods of the Dark Web by Lucas Mangum. Now, before I get started, I just want to give everyone a heads up that this is an extreme book that has graphic scenes of violence against women and children. Nonetheless, these moments are necessary to the plot as the author is using them to comment on our modern day. Regardless, if these are subjects that you don't care to hear about, you'll definitely want to skip the spoilers section of this episode as I will be discussing these moments in greater detail. But as far as the remainder of this episode is concerned, I'll be as delicate and polite as possible. As a side note, if you're a fan of Lucas Mangum or this book in particular, I have some good news because after I finished my read, I reached out to the author and asked if he wouldn't mind answering a few questions I had regarding his work. In response, he was kind enough to take time out of his busy schedule so I could learn a little bit more about what inspired him. So, for that reason, I would simply like to thank Mr. Mangum for participating with this and for taking time out of his busy schedule for me. Also, I would like to brag because I do have a signed copy of Gods of the Dark Web, which it's signed Alex, always use a VPN, Lucas Mangum. So, yeah, I'm totally happy about this. I'm not going to part with it. And if you would like to contact the author, I have included a link to his website in the description section of this episode. So be sure to check him out. With bragging rights aside, I would like to add that I buddy read this with my good online friends Hanny and Nisa, as well as my longtime friend Oliver. And even though I've read quite a few books with Hanny and Nisa, this was our first time including Oliver. Which it goes without saying that we had a great time together as we had a lot of fun discussions about the book's characters, themes, and overall concept. So, if any of you are watching, I just want to say thank you for buddy reading this with me, and I hope you enjoy this review. But, anywho, without me rambling on any further, let's join Niles as he braves the darker corners of the internet to uncover what happened to his little brother who recently went missing. Gods of the Dark Web by Lucas Mangum introduces a teenage boy named Leon who wakes up in an abandoned warehouse after having been kidnapped. And upon him taking in his surroundings, it's established that his abduction came about because he and his friend Shiloh had surfed around the dark web, which, despite them taking precautions, their online presence was enough to pique the interest of a cult whose duty is to provide sacrifices to a technological god that dwells in the Matrix. From here, the focus shifts to Leon's older brother Niles, who recently suffered the death of his son and the divorce that followed due to that tragedy, which, as he's trying to pick up the pieces and move forward in life, one evening he's signing copies of his new true crime book for his fans when his father calls and explains that Leon has gone missing. At first, Niles thinks that perhaps Leon and their father had another argument and this caused Leon to run off. But considering how worried their father sounds, Niles takes this call seriously and he returns home to try to help in any way possible. Meanwhile, as Leon remains missing, Niles decides to do some personal sleuthing where he eventually speaks with Shiloh. And this is when he discovers that Shiloh and Leon had actually been using the dark web as a platform to organize peaceful protest for their chapter of Peace Ponies, which this organization is described as a wide reaching group that opposes economic inequality, homophobia, war for profit, transphobia, as well as sexual abuse. However, with the last peaceful protests they had, things went south. And because of that, Shiloh admits that he and Leon had returned to the dark web so they could purchase an illegal firearm to protect themselves. Furthermore, Shiloh explains that as he and Leon were looking around, they happened upon this mysterious site that featured a ghost town called Avalon Lake. And despite them taking precautions so they wouldn't get cyber attacked, shortly after visiting this mysterious site, they received an anonymous email that said, "We hope you like our town. You'll be visiting soon." After gaining that lead, Niles swan dives into the dark web, where he becomes exposed to the underbelly of society and all of its unspeakable crimes. Then, as he goes to websites that progress from bad to worse, he finally happens upon the URL that features Avalon Lake. However, after he reports this to the police and they explain that this is not in their jurisdiction, he decides to take matters into his own hands, where he eventually discovers the horror that he's dealing with is one that blends the Old and New Testaments with Lovecraft and the cyber world. At last, here's the moment you've all been waiting for, as it's now time for me to reveal the answers that Mr. Mangum provided me in regards to his book. Question number one. Gods of the Dark Web is a very original concept. What inspired you to write a novella about the dark web and mix elder gods into it? Lucas Mangum explained, the concept for Gods of the Dark Web came from reading all these creepy accounts of people who had gone on the dark web, found all sorts of horrific things, and in some cases endangered their lives. I was fascinated by the idea of a forbidden zone on the internet, beneath social media and the news sites. Being a fan of cosmic horror, I began thinking about the idea of the internet as a grimoire. The fact you need a special browser to access the dark web speaks to a ritualistic nature as well. From there, coming up with a story about an eldritch cult and its deity happened pretty much organically. Question number two. During our buddy read, a friend of mine felt like most of the male characters were toxic and misogynistic. What was it like to build these type of characters? Was that your overall goal with their development? Lucas Mangum replied, I'm glad you asked about this, as it's something that bothers people about the book, even more so than the graphic violence and scenes of sexual degradation. To properly answer this, it's helpful to consider when I wrote it. The Gamergate controversy had recently been in the news, and the Trump campaign was in full force. In other words, toxic masculinity seemed almost in vogue. The environment in 2015 through 2016 was unfortunately prime time for anyone who had even a seed of misogyny in them to water it. I don't know if I had a goal by writing my characters this way beyond doing what writers have always done. We're often credited for our imaginations, and that's a big part of the process, but we also sometimes simply write what we see. That was how I built characters with those traits and why it was so easy to do so. Question number three. Throughout the novella, there are moments that are disturbing. In particular, baby blood stew comes to mind. When writing scenes this disturbing, how do you get in the mindset to go there? Also, do you ever feel like you have gone too far with the scene or subject? Lucas Mangum explained, I'm not sure there's much I do to get in the mindset for writing a disturbing scene, at least not beyond writing a story that calls for it. That said, I do usually need to get up and go for a walk or watch something funny to clear my mind after I've written such a scene. The baby blood stew chapter grew out of an anxiety I had about becoming a new father. I was working as a 911 call taker at the time, so I was only seeing the ugly side of life and the world. And so many times I wondered, am I an asshole for bringing a kid into all of this? Am I essentially helping create a life simply to feed it to a world that's filled with so much cruelty? That chapter gets brought up a lot by readers. Even Sean Duriger, who narrated the audiobook, said he needed to stop recording and get a drink after that scene. It goes to show that we horror writers are most effective when we set out to scare ourselves. I'm not sure I've ever gone too far per se, as anytime I've done something, it was because I felt the story called for it. Everyone has their own line separating what they will or won't read, and I have some boundaries myself. However, my line tends to blur, and sometimes it'll fade altogether if what I'm reading is good. For example, there were several times I almost DNF'd along the path of torment, but Chandler Morrison is such a talented writer, I kept going back to read more. Question number 4. A big theme that we all noticed was how everyone has a dark side that they like to satisfy, and with that comes repercussions. Was that theme intentional? What was your overall goal upon writing this work? Lucas Mangum answered, the theme wasn't initially intentional, but as I saw it emerging, I made sure to emphasize it more in order to give the book more cohesion. The goal was to write something unsettling that also raised questions for the reader about humanity's dual nature. Question number 5. Will we see more stories about the dark web gods? Will we learn their lore? What was your inspiration for your design of the gods? Lucas Mangum replied, my out of print book, Digital Darkness, isn't a proper sequel, but it's sort of related. At some point, I'd like to write a more direct continuation. Since the book is several years old now, I may go the Evil Dead 2 route and write a sequel that's also sort of a remake. We'll see. Now that we have that covered, it's time to move on to the spoiler segment, which, if you haven't read this book before or you want to avoid the gory details, now is the time that you click away. Which, if you want to do this, just scroll down to the comments and you'll see that I have a pinned comment at the top with the timestamp in it. Once you click on that timestamp, it will direct you away from the spoilers and bring you to the thoughts section. Now you only have 17 seconds to do this. So, ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few moments of this book that were really disturbing. First up is the scene when Shiloh gets hacked. So, at this point, it had earlier been established that Shiloh laughed at pictures of sexually abused children. And after he did that, he just continued forward with life without any worries. However, this one particular night, as he's gaming, he notices that his Facebook page starts blowing up with comments. And when he checks it out, he sees people are calling him a sicko, a pedo, and also using derogatory words against him. Well, after he decides to check his outbox, he sees that someone hacked his account and they sent out a mass email to everyone on his contact list with the subject head that says, "Sorry, this is me." Then, after he opens the email that everyone received, he sees that it is full of graphic images regarding exploited children. Y'all, even though these pictures weren't described in fine detail, the thought alone was jarring enough to make me feel shocked and disgusted. But to be perfectly honest, I do have to applaud the author here because he didn't go overboard. And I think had he described this just a little bit more, it really would have been unnecessary and it would have been just way too much. Now, even though this moment did serve as a shock factor, I feel like it was also karmatic, as Shiloh had earlier been laughing at images of sexually abused children. And it was this exact same thing that had the potential to ruin his life had he actually lived. Which, on a creepier note, considering how these pictures were used against Shiloh, it makes me wonder if the cult decided on this form of attack by coincidence, or if they had actually eavesdropped on him and had overheard him laughing at the pictures of exploited children. Or another possibility is these photos were sent by the gods themselves. Regardless, this really does bring into perspective how easily one's privacy can be invaded, because I truly believe that this was deliberately sent by the cult because they had overheard him laughing. The next moment that stood out to me was the baby blood stew scene. Now, following the email attack that I just spoke of, Niles receives a call from Leon's girlfriend Dana, who explains that Shiloh's dead body has been found, and because of its condition, it's suspected that he committed suicide. Well, despite the bad news that he just received and the dangers that are at hand, Niles goes on to the dark web to look for the peace ponies. But after he masturbates to some abusive porn, he eventually calls it a night because he feels disgusted with himself. So, determined to find his missing brother, the next day, Niles returns to the dark web out of hopes that it can provide him with some answers. However, as he's looking around, he comes across this one particular video that has an up close shot of a cutting board, and just out of view in the background, he can hear a baby screaming bloody murder. Then, as the video progresses, he sees that its main focus is nothing more than just chopping up vegetables to go in a stew. But once the vegetables are added to the water, the cook goes to the soiled baby crib, takes the baby, brings it over to the chopping block, and begins to hack away its limbs, which are then added into the stew pot. This right here is one of the many reasons why I have zero interest in ever going onto the dark web. Like, throughout my life, I've heard some pretty horrific stories regarding its content, which I hope those are nothing more than urban legends, or they're simply nothing more than lies that were created to scare people away. But on the off chance that those stories are real, I never want to expose myself to that crap whatsoever. And while I feel like this moment did provide a solid shock factor, I feel like it also made a point, as this is when Niles realizes that there's a philosophy to this type of depraved entertainment, specifically one that encourages viewers to push their boundaries and to be their most twisted. Aside from that, this moment obviously made me feel very uncomfortable, which this is mostly because of how the author paced himself out. Like, I knew one way or another that baby was going to end up in the stew pot, but I didn't know how it would be prepared beforehand or how long it would be alive during the preparation process. And as everything started to unfold, my imagination concocted quite a few horrific scenarios that filled me with absolute dread. The final moment I would like to talk about regards the scene where Tama dies, which, leading up to this, the day after the baby blood stew video, Niles wakes up to a mysterious email that shows his brother's car is parked next to an abandoned church at Avalon Lake. And since the police aren't going to do anything about this because they claim it's not their jurisdiction, Niles drives out to the ghost town where he encounters a young girl named Tama who had been sent there on a dare. After Niles and Tama decide to stick together, they eventually enter the abandoned church where they encounter a defiled statue of Jesus that's surrounded by vines and wires. Also, this is when they come across the document that appears to be constructed of the Old and New Testaments as well as Lovecraftian theologies, which, after Tama identifies this as being the Futurist Manifesto, a nearby computer comes on and prints off a message which welcomes them to Avalon Lake. Yet in the next sentence, it says they're going to hell. Seeing as they're in trouble, Niles and Tama run off to his car to escape. But once there, they find where his tires have been slashed. And even though they intend to call for help, they discover their phones have been hacked and a blocker has been put on them so they can't make any calls out. Shortly thereafter, they're attacked by two cultists who knock them out. And when Niles wakes up, he finds where he and Tama have both been tied to chairs in an abandoned warehouse. From here, Niles explains to Tama that he has a knife in his shoe, which, if she's able to get that knife, there's the chance that she can cut them free. And even though she's able to knock her chair over and make it to Niles, before she can do anything else, a figure enters the room, which, due to the description that's provided, this pale, bloated monstrosity is described as being wrapped in wires and having multiple limbs. Also, to make its appearance even more horrific, it has three eyeless heads stitched to its chest, which, among those heads, one of them actually belonged to Leon. Following this horrendous creature, two masked cultists enter the room, and upon Niall seeing how they walk two abused women on dog leashes, he realizes that these people will not stop at anything. And he also has the epiphany that the darkness in them is the same as the darkness within himself. Furthermore, he comes to terms with the idea that this darkness is actually a disease. Meanwhile, as the cultists are brutalizing Tama, all of the computer monitors magically turn on. And because of the power that they're releasing, this causes a hole to open up in the god's stomach, which acts as a mouth. Then, as the cultists are preoccupied by their god, Tama makes her way over to Niles, takes the knife out of his shoe, and finally cuts away their ropes. However, before Niles and Tama can escape, a set of tentacles grabs them. And even though Niles is able to break free, instead of him helping Tama, he takes advantage of the circumstance, and while the god is focused on her, he hauls ass. Then, as the god eats Tama from her feet up, Niles does briefly feel guilt. Nonetheless, he eventually reasons there was nothing he could have done to start with. First up, this scene stood out to me because I really enjoyed the originality behind the god's design. And to be honest, I wish I could have gained a little bit more of the god, especially in regards to its lore. Also, I really appreciated this segment because this was when Niles realized that one's inner darkness is a disease, and his darkness is no different than anybody else's. Now, even though he had this epiphany near the end of the book, Mangum had invested a fraction of darkness in Niles at the beginning when it was established that Niles was a true crime author. Not only that, but one would argue that by Niles writing true crime, he's satisfying the morbid curiosity of his readers, no differently than content creators satisfying those who go onto the dark web. Which, as the book progresses and Niles becomes more exposed to violence, we see his darkness grow like a virus where it gradually takes over his morals. Like, for example, the first time this is shown is when he masturbates to abusive porn. And even though he feels bad about what he did after it's over, it doesn't change the fact that he was aroused by footage of a woman being beaten. Then we get to the scene where he pushes himself on Dana, and even though he finally takes the answer no seriously, he should have honestly respected her answer being no the first time she said it, and he never should have pushed himself on her to start with. Then we have the scene where he's checking out Tama, and he feels no remorse about this whatsoever, which, to shine a little bit more light on this, Niles is old enough to be the father of Tama and Dana. So, yeah, both of these girls were underage. And last, we get to his transformed character at the end, who believes that it feels good to be violent. So, due to how Niles became more desensitized, I feel like the author provided us with a good example of how inner darkness is a disease that not only can affect the individual, but it can also spread to others. I would like to take this opportunity to bitch. Now, even after Niles had jerked off to some abusive porn, I was like, all right, dude, I'm still rooting for you. You got that shit out of your system. Now it's time for you to redeem yourself and be the person I know you are. And do you want to know what this little crumb of dick cheese did? He did the exact damn opposite, because a few pages later, he ends up macking on his little brother's girlfriend who is friggin' underage. Then after that, he's like being a total creeper to Tama by checking out the junk in her trunk, and guess what? She too is underage. And I'm just gonna be real about this. I'm gonna sing like the chunky little bitch that I am. Had this walking dickweed actually lived, I guarantee you that he would have been in prison and he would have become some Bubba's bitch because he would have gotten arrested for not being able to keep his little inchworm in his pants. Also, I know old shit for brains was in a panic here, but when Tama got picked up by the tentacles and she was about to get chowed down on, I honestly believe that he could have done something to prevent this. I mean, the damn god's mouth was gaped open like he had just gotten freckle punched. Old dude could have easily thrown something in there to choke him, but no. His little scrub ass runs right out the door and leaves her screaming because you want to know what? He is a cowardly ass son of a bitch. Gods of the Dark Web by Lucas Mangum was a fast paced read that I was able to knock out in one sitting. And even though it had a couple of grotesque moments, I feel like it would be suitable for those who are looking to get into splatterpunk or extreme literature. Now, as far as characters are concerned, we felt like everyone was fleshed out just enough for the author to make his point. And as far as themes go, we notice where this book was a cautionary tale that warned against the dangers of the dark web. Also, it commented on violence for the sake of entertainment as well as misogyny. And on a deeper level, it even presented some philosophies, one of which shows that a person's inner darkness is a disease. And another one commented on how negative places can attract negative entities. Character wise, pretty much none of the men were likable in this book, which I think this type of development was deliberate in order for the author to make a point. Now, with that said, we do have two female characters who come in and out of the book that are being walked around on leashes like they're dogs. And due to their submissive nature towards the dominant men who act as their masters, it's never established if they were groomed into this, if they're acting out of fear of what'll happen if they don't obey, or if this is a role that they wanted to start with. Nonetheless, whatever it is they're feeling, at one point the book does note that they hang their heads in shame. Other than the cultist, I felt like Shiloh and Leon were fairly disgusting characters. For example, Shiloh laughed at images of sexually abused children, and collectively the two of them had decided to go onto the dark web to illegally purchase a gun because the last peaceful protests they did ended in violence. Which, no matter if they were at fault or not for the last protest ending the way it did, if they were to kill someone during the next demonstration, even if it was self defense, it would give that organization that they were representing a bad name. Overall, even though they're teenagers, and I'm sure some of their immature decisions could be blamed on their age, I really got the impression that they were simply morally corrupt. Also, I felt like the only reason why they joined an organization like the Peace Ponies was because they were nothing more than posers and they wanted to jump on the bandwagon. Which I say this because if they were really trying to promote peace, they wouldn't be trying to purchase an illegal firearm, and Shiloh would not have laughed at images of abused children. Other than those two, we have Niles, which at first I actually liked him. However, once his moral decay kicked in and his libido started to shine through, I realized he was doomed. And although we don't have much of his backstory to go on prior to him visiting the dark web, I get the sense that he always had these sexual tendencies, but it wasn't until he became exposed to the violent content online that he became more comfortable with his taboos. Also, after I had a chance to digest everything, I felt like Niles and the content creators of the dark web had more in common than what they realized. For example, when Niles stepped on the page, it was established that he was a true crime author whose work satisfied the morbid curiosity of his readers. Which, in comparison, we have the content creators of the dark web who had been providing disturbing material for their consumers. And granted, what Niles is doing is nowhere near as bad as someone who's creating snuff or illegal porn. Nonetheless, they're still providing disturbing entertainment for a demographic who craves violence. And even though these characters had little page time, I feel like only the females of this book were worthy of our empathy or sympathy. Like, for example, we have Dana who has to fight off Niles's advances, and at one point, Niles is checking out Tama and objectifying her. And while these girls are young enough to be his daughters, it really brings into perspective how men can objectify minors or women when they aren't doing anything to draw sexual attention. Also, there was one scene near the end where I really did feel sorry for Tama, but if I were to elaborate on that, I would be revealing some spoilers. Theme wise, I feel like this work was a cautionary tale that warned against the dangers of the dark web. Now, in the past, I had a friend who worked for a police department who explained to me that the dark web was mostly nothing more than stolen social security numbers and investigators who were trying to catch offenders. Even still, I have no interest in ever visiting the dark web because I don't want to stumble upon something that will destroy me for the rest of my existence, similar to how these characters stumbled upon violent and explicit content. Anywho, back to what I was saying. To be honest, this book could stand as a cautionary tale in a couple of different ways. One of which shows no matter what degree of precautions you might take, if you're visiting seedy places online, eventually a hacker is going to outsmart you and gain your information or worse. Secondly, depending on the person, there's the risk that the individual could become desensitized after exposing themselves to hyperviolent content. In turn, whenever this individual comes across something that's harmful or illegal, they're going to see it as nothing more than another normal thing. Which, like the book suggests, if your inner darkness is fed, there's the chance that it could spread like a disease. Another subject we noticed was violence for the sake of entertainment. And while this subject could go a million different ways in regards to snuff or illegal pornography, it's important to remember one disturbing thing. If there's someone sick enough out there to want it, there's someone sick enough out there to produce it. Also, as we were reading, our friend Oliver brought to our attention that at times this book felt misogynistic and bigoted. And as we discussed this, none of us really felt like the author himself was a misogynist or a bigot. Instead, we felt like he was using this opportunity for his art to reflect our current times. Which, since this book was written under the Trump administration, it makes sense why Mangum took these creative liberties. Now, because of the characters that I discussed, I feel like I already covered the philosophy of how darkness can be a disease. May that darkness be internal or external. But with that in mind, I feel like the book also commented on how negative places can attract negative entities, which in reality, a friend of mine who's a paranormal investigator explained that she doesn't like to visit places like abandoned asylums, prisons, hospitals, or cemeteries because those places have low vibrations due to the torment and sadness that's happened there. And because of these places having those low vibrations, they have the potential to attract entities that never existed in human form. And with that said, it feels like Mangum used this concept, but instead of him just putting it in our external world, he also included the dark web, which, to be honest, I had never seen this done before. And it does make sense that a place such as the dark web that's filled with such depravity would be the ideal spot to attract elder gods. Overall, Gods of the Dark Web didn't scare me or creep me out. However, there were a few times that I felt very uncomfortable, and there was one scene that did gross me out. Gods of the Dark Web by Lucas Mangum is a book that says a lot without having to beat its reader over the head. And while my friends and I really did enjoy the creativity behind the elder gods and their minions, we also understood that they were nothing more than a side item to the plot. And I do fear had Mangum actually invested a detailed description of their lore, then that could have possibly taken away from the importance of the plot. But at the end of the day, if any of the things I mentioned seem like they're a little too much for you, then this is probably not going to be the book for you to read. However, if you are looking for a fast paced book that you can knock out in one sitting that combines cosmic horror with technology, then I do highly recommend Gods of the Dark Web. Now that we're at the end of this episode, I would like to thank these amazing people for contributing to my Patreon account. As you can tell, some of the names listed here are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute to my Patreon account, I have a link available in the description section of this episode, where for $5 a month, I'll give you a shout out at the end of my videos. And if there is a certain profession you would like for me to tie to your name, just let me know and I'll do that. Also, I do have a $10 tier available where for $10 a month, I'll still give you the shout out as you see here, but I do creepy photography on the side, so at the beginning of every month, I send out one of my creepy photos. From there, you can print it off and do whatever you like with it. So if you're able to do this, that's awesome. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can continue to have a good time together. Also, if you would like to hit me up on social media, links to my Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are all available in the description section of this episode. And if you've not subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell because I do have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope you have a great week and sweet nightmares.